When I talk through this series over the next 4 weeks, and this series Move, my hope is that whatever it is that God is calling you to take a step of faith towards and move into, that you'll be encouraged and you'll be emboldened to move in that direction. Because I do believe that each one of us, and perhaps maybe it's something that you have recently taken a step and began to move in a certain direction, but perhaps there have been some stumbling blocks or some doubt that's creeped in, whatever that is. But maybe there's some of you that you feel like God is really calling you into something, and it's a little bit out of your comfort zone. You're a little uneasy about it. You're uncertain. There are plenty of excuses why not to do it. But I believe that if we can trust God on a whole new level for whatever it is that He wants to do in your life, that I believe He wants to do dynamic things in you and through you. And that's what these next 4 weeks are going to be about. And let me qualify this whole series up front. All right, because I don't want you to misunderstand me that I'm encouraging recklessness, I'm encouraging selfishness, because so often in messages or series like this, we can let our own selfish desires get in the way and say, oh, well, I really want to do this and it'll make me happier, so that's what I'm going to do. And Matt said that I need to move in that direction. It's not what I'm saying. Whatever it is I believe that you believe it is that God's calling you into. And if you're not sure, then you can go back to this word, because if it's contrary to this word, then it's not of God. But I don't know what it is in your life. I don't know if it's a job situation. Some of you maybe have been contemplating or feel like God is leading you into changing jobs, or maybe selling a business that you have, or maybe buying a business or starting a new business. I don't know what that is. Perhaps for some of you, it's continuing or furthering your education or completing an education process that you stepped away from for whatever reason years ago, and it's just something you feel like you want to move into. Maybe it's writing a book. I don't know what that is. Perhaps maybe it's a money situation where you're tired of being confined to the shackles of debt, and you have no margin, and it's suffocating, and you want to take some drastic steps and move in a certain direction and trust God for it, but you're just hesitant for whatever reason. Maybe it's adoption. Maybe it's being a foster parent. I don't know what it is, and it may seem insignificant to you in the grand scheme of the universe and eternity, or it may seem insignificant to other people when you talk about it, but it's not insignificant to God. And if He wants to use you to do it, then there's a purpose that He has for you that He's calling you to. And I want us to be encouraged and emboldened to take that step and to move where God is calling us. So what I want to do over the next 4 weeks, counting today, I want to go through and I want to use a story from Scripture and the history books that show God's faithfulness and how God called someone out to do something. They took a step of faith and God showed up in a big way. I want to have a takeaway each week, and collectively, hopefully, there'll be pieces of the puzzle that come together for you where you're encouraged in whatever it is that God is calling you to do. And so today I want to start off in the book of Esther. And if you have your Bible, you can open up and turn. I'm going to kind of be paraphrasing through the story. If you've got your app, you can get that open and you can walk through it. But let me say this, I'm only going to hit some of the high points and some of the things that kind of will reinforce the idea that we're going to talk through today. But I would greatly encourage you to go back and read the book of Esther today or this week. It's a phenomenal story. God's faithfulness. If they made a movie about it today, it would probably have to be R-rated. Just some of the things that are involved in it. It's extremely engaging. It's only 10 chapters long. You can read it in under an hour. And I'm telling you, it's better than any novel you'll pick up and read this week. So I would encourage you to go back and get more of the details behind some of the things that we talk about today. But when you open up Esther in the very first chapter, you see this king Ahasuerus. And this king in the beginning of the Bible is putting on this banquet or this party. And this party is lasting for 180 days. 180 days the king has this party going. He's ruling over this area in Persia that's this vast region, and all these different areas and provinces that are within this region that he's ruling over. He's bringing in the princes and the governors and different people to come in and be a part of this party. He's kind of buttering them up because he's getting ready to ask them to go to war with him. And so he's trying to get them to come in and say, okay, I'm showing you guys a good time. time. I need you to be on my side. Well, at the end of this 180 days, he has another banquet, another party that's 7 days long that he opens up to anybody and everybody. The peasants and the well-off and everybody in between. Everybody's partying for an entire week. Well, at the end of this week, spirits are flowing. Spirits are high. Everybody's happy. The king's feeling real good about himself. Well, he calls for his queen, Queen Vashti, to come in, and he wants to parade her in front of these men who are sauced up because she was, by all accounts, a very beautiful woman. Well, historical accounts show, it doesn't tell us in text, but you go back and you can read some historical accounts that perhaps because she was pregnant with his son, or perhaps because she just didn't want to be paraded through like eye candy in front of these guys and let whatever happens with their comments and their catcalls, she refused to come into the area where the king and these men were. Well, as you can probably imagine in those days, that didn't go over well with the king. He was not happy about it, to the point that he exiled her. And the only reason most historical accounts think that he didn't have her executed was because she was pregnant with his son. So he exiles her, dethrones her. She's no longer queen, and she's forgotten about, just because she wouldn't come into a room when he asked her to. Well, that began the process of trying to find a new queen. And in those days, the process was much like an American Idol / Survivor show, where these messengers would go out into the province. They would find all of the virgins and the very beautiful women who they thought the king might be interested in making his queen. So they go out throughout all the region, and they find these women, they bring them back. Well, one of those young ladies was a Jewish girl named Esther. And Esther, her parents had passed away, and her uncle Mordecai was raising her and had taken her in, and was basically, she was his daughter. Well, she was taken and was paraded in front of the king. Well, as you can probably imagine, the book's named Esther. She becomes queen, and the king chooses her to come in and be a part of royalty. Well, Mordecai, her uncle, was of some prominence, to the point where he was able to be within a certain distance in the king's court and within the region of the palace. And so he would go in every day and kind of walk around and visit with different people, but really was waiting on messages from Queen Esther's servants to come and tell him how she was doing. Again, his daughter at this point, niece, who he's taken in to raise. And so word would come back and give updates. Well, one day he's out there hanging out, waiting on a message to come out, and he gets wind of a plot to kill the king from a couple of men who were talking and trying to raise up this rebellion. Well, he sends word back through a messenger, one of her servants, back to Esther and says, look, this is what's going on. These men are plotting to kill the king. I just want you to know, pass it on to the king. So she does. She passes it on, and she gives Mordecai credit. Says, Mordecai, this man that's out here, became aware of this. They investigated it, found out that it was true. They had the rebellion executed, and the king carried on. And he said, let's chronicle this. Let's write this down in the history books and document it, and have this guy Mordecai recognized by name. So they do. All that transpired. Shortly after that, the king promotes this man named Haman into second in command. Now, Haman had a complex where he enjoyed the attention. He had an ego, was very arrogant, very prideful, as maybe a lot of people would be, being moved into the second in command of the king. Well, he would go out into the city or into the town in the area, and people would recognize him and they would bow down to him. Some would honor him in different ways, whatever it was. Well, Mordecai refused. History records show that Mordecai's family and Haman's family had some bad blood years prior. Well, both of them knew this would be the case, and so every time Haman walked by Mordecai, Mordecai would just ignore him and not pay him any respect. Well, this stirred up quite a bit of furiousness within Haman. So he went to the king. This guy's second in command. He goes to the king and he says, hey, king, listen. There's this nation of people that are out there amongst your region that you're king over. They have their own set of laws, and they don't follow your laws. They follow their own laws. Now, to qualify that, their laws, they were following Mosaic law. And the Mosaic law would call them to a higher standard. Part of that would be to follow the laws of the land and to live peaceably among the men that were there. So Haman goes in and kind of distorts it and twists it, and he doesn't really let facts get in the way of his agenda. There was fake news all the way back then. So he goes in and he tells the king, it's to your benefit, king, if we wipe these people out. Now he never says, according to the document, he never says the Jews by name, but he refers to them, and the king says, okay, that's fine, whatever. It really insignificant to the king. Well, Haman has this decree written up, and he takes it to the king. The king seals it with his stamp. Anytime the king would seal a decree with his stamp, it was in place and could not be changed. He couldn't even change his own decree. And so it would go out into the land, and what Haman wrote up was that on a specific day, almost a year ahead from the time the decree was written, that every army in the region would go in and wipe out the Jews that were in this entire area. Wipe out all the Jews completely. It would be a specific day that would be declared, and on that day that would take place. So Mordecai finds out about this. He starts panicking. He's running through the streets wailing and crying, and he knows that he's the reason for this entire decree for the whole nation of Jews to be wiped out. Well, word gets back to Esther about Mordecai's demeanor and his state of mind, and she wants to know what's going on. So she sends a servant out to him. Here's Mordecai's words. We're going to pick this up here in 4 verse 8 if you're following along. Esther 4:8. Mordecai gives the servant a copy of the edict that was sent out. He wants the servant to take it back to Esther. He says, so that the servant might show Esther and inform her and to order her to go into the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. Now, there was this call in this moment that Esther was, through Mordecai, was called out to do. There was this situation where Mordecai was saying, you're in a place right now, and this is why you're where you are. Here's what we need you to do. Now, if you're Esther, you're probably remembering how the king treated Vashti when she wouldn't even come into the area that he called her for. And look at what, as it goes on, look at the law that was in place at the time. Verse 11, Esther says, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who comes to the king's inner court and is not summoned has but one law: he be put to death, unless the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned in over 30 days. So Esther sends word back to Mordecai, says, listen, I hear what you're saying, but do you not understand what is going to transpire if I go in unannounced and unsummoned by the king? I'm going to be put to death. And I haven't been summoned by the king in 30 days. So I don't know if I've lost favor with the king. I don't know what's going on. Do you know what you're asking me to do? All these excuses, all these reasons, all these circumstances that look like it would be an exercise in futility. Look at what Mordecai says in his response. Verse 14. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. And you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Go back to the first part of 14 here, if you will. Here's what I want you guys to know and understand. Mordecai knew the promises of God. Mordecai knew the word of God. Relief and deliverance was going to come to the Jews. Now, whether or not Esther wanted to participate in that and be a part of God's plan and part of God carrying out his promises, that was going to be up to Esther. And if she didn't want to do it and the Jews began to become annihilated, she was a Jew. Ultimately, she would have to be taken out because of the decree. Here's what I want to start the process of laying this foundation for you for this series. Because here's something I want you to take with you today. The more you know God and his promises, the more you trust him. The more you know God and the more you know his promises, the more you can trust him. Mordecai knew his promises. Mordecai knew that God was going to save his people one way or another, whether or not Esther participated or not. So the more you trust him, the more you know him, the more you're willing to take that step and move forward. So she's still got a decision to make at this point, right? He comes back and says, God's going to accomplish his purpose. I know all these excuses, all these reasons, but you got a decision to make. Here's what she said. Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. The first thing that she does is turns to God when she realizes what's at hand and what she's being called to move towards. Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 3:5. We are not adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God. So she knows that this is something well beyond her abilities and well beyond her means and completely outside of her realm of understanding or knowledge or anything, that the adequacy and the sufficiency and the power to pull off what she's asked to do comes only from God. Now, here's where we are. She's got good intentions at this point. She's asking people to pray for her. She's asking people to fast for her. She's giving it some time to process and think about it. Good intentions. She still has to make a decision whether or not she's going to step into what it is that God's calling her to. Let's see what she does. Chapter 5, verse 1. Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's room, sitting on his throne in the throne room, opposite the entrance to the palace. She walks in, and the king saw her. Now imagine Esther at that moment. She knows it could go one of two ways. He gives the old, she's done. It's that simple. She didn't know if she's already lost favor with him. This is just an excuse and justification for him to take her out. Or he's going to extend the golden scepter. The king saw her when he was sitting on his throne. She obtained favor in his sight. The king extended to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. He knew she was there for a purpose. He said, what is it that you want? Ask whatever it is, and I'll give you up to half the kingdom. A little bit of hyperbole. He wasn't going to give her half the kingdom, but it's like, look, whatever it is, within reason, ask me. She was really calculated in this. She didn't just jump in and say, we've got a problem. This is the situation. She said, you know what? I want to put on a banquet and a party for you. And he was like, okay, we got that. That sounds good. She knew the way to his heart. She had seen him operate, and when he was trying to gain favor with someone else, she turned that around on him. She said, but I only want 2 people to come, you and Haman, to come to this party. He was like, okay, that's fine. Second in command, that's my guy. Come on. Haman comes. They have a great time. Middle of the banquet in this party. King looks at Esther and says, all right, what is it that you want? She says, I'd like for us to have another party. Let's get back together and do this again. All right, great time. Sounds good to me. So Haman leaves. As he's leaving, the text says that he was pleased and glad of heart. But then he saw Mordecai, and he became enraged again. And he gets home and he says, look, I am second in command to the king. I've got all this honor bestowed on me. Even the queen notices that she invites only me to this party. And I see Mordecai, and I can't even enjoy it because I'm filled with so much rage. People in his house are like, well, that's easy. Just erect a gallows, this extended pole, and have Mordecai put to death. Come up with something, have the king put him to death, and you'll be away with him, and then you can enjoy your position and your place with the king. Mordecai's like, that's a great idea. Let's keep the party going. So that night, they have the gallows built that was intended for Mordecai. That very night, the king could not sleep. Now, you can chalk it up to just coincidental amnesia. I'm going to keep reading and then let you decide. He gave an order to bring the book of Chronicles to be read. This was 5 years after the foiled plot that Mordecai sent word that was coming to him. 5 years later, these Chronicles are read. And it just so happened that the story of Mordecai came up that night. Ain't that something? What a coincidence. So it was found that Mordecai had reported this rebellion, and the king looked and said, what honor was bestowed upon this man Mordecai? And they said, none that we know of. He said, let's change that. Tomorrow, let's bestow on him some honor like that's never been seen. So the next day, Haman's on his way to the king to let him know we got to get rid of Mordecai. He goes in and the king says, hey, for it is, whatever it is you got to get to, I got to ask you a question. If you were going to recognize someone in the kingdom and bestow honor on someone that the king wanted to really pour honor on, what would you do? Haman's thinking, this is me, right? So I would give him a robe that the king has worn. I would put him on a horse that the king has ridden. I'd parade him through town, tell everybody the king honors this man. Everybody look and celebrate this king. King says, that is a great idea. Now take my robe and my horse and go do that to Mordecai. And Haman's like, hold up. But he does it. He goes out and he bestows this honor. Mordecai's robed, riding through town on this horse. Everybody's praising Mordecai. They go to the banquet. It's the queen, the king, and Haman. Halfway through, king looks at Esther and says, what is it that you want? She says, there was a decree that went out that me and my people were to be executed all throughout this land on this day. King says, hold up, who said that? Well, and there was no indication that Haman ever said that it would be the Jews. Now, you got to think that he would know, but it was probably not that significant to him in the grand scheme of things, so it may not even given it a second thought. It's like, who wrote this decree? I'm going to have them executed. Haman's sitting over there, and the queen's just like, this guy here. Haman panics, starts begging for his life. King says, out. Now, check this part out. The king's looking for a place to execute him. Where do y'all think he takes him? To the gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai. The king had Haman hung on his own gallows that he made. Now, ain't that something? Eventually, Mordecai was promoted to second in command. They issued a new decree where the Jews could defend themselves. They did successfully. The king saw the favor of God on them. Honor was bestowed on Mordecai and the Jewish people, and the entire nation was saved. All because this young Jewish girl, seemingly insignificant through the pages of secular history, trusted God enough to take a step and move into a direction she felt like he was calling. Now, let me ask you something. What is it that you don't believe that God can use you to do to accomplish his purpose? What is it? I don't know. I can bet it's probably not to save a nation, although it might be. And it's probably not to start a new church here in Texarkana or anywhere where there's 300 churches for that matter, although it might be. Such was the case with Kel and Connie Magnus and a group of men and women here in this church over 18 years ago when they felt like God was calling them to do something different in this community. And we're sitting here as a result of them taking a step and moving. Listen to their story.
Heritage was born out of hurt and confusion. We were just a handful of people that had just come through a very toxic church experience. And for me and my family, church life was a big part of who we were. We were involved in everything. We were there every time the doors were open. We made sure our children were involved in everything that was available for them. So experiencing what we went through for us as a family was very unsettling. It had really soured me to the point to where I felt like I was done completely with organized religion. My intention was to never go back to church. I fully intended to stay at home and teach Bible studies to my family. Connie, on the other hand, had a different intention. She never wanted to stay out of church. She always wanted to find some place to go, but just to blend into the crowd. One Sunday soon after that, we were at home, Sunday morning, and there was a knock at our front door. And we go and open the door, and it's a couple from the church that we had just come out of, and they just wanted to come over and hang out with us. So we put on a cup of coffee and sitting around the kitchen table, and a few minutes after that, another knock on the front door, and it was another couple from the church that we came out of. for the same reason, just wanted to stay around the house and hang out with us. So we pulled up some more chairs, and a few minutes later, another knock, another couple. Well, next Sunday rolled around, that same group of people came back, but this time there were more. That was probably the first time that I began to think that maybe there was something going on more than just a group of people that shared a common hurt, banding together. That was the first time I thought there might be something that's actually happening here. Then the thought, as we prayed together as a group for what God's intention was with us, I remember this thought coming in, if we're being called out to do something, surely we're not being called out to be another group of people like what he already has on every other street corner in Texarkana. If he was calling us out, surely it was to be something different. The problem was we just didn't know what different was at the time. As we continued to grow and continued to seek God's intention for us, the first time that I realized what I think was happening, there was kind of a sense of panic and almost fear that gripped me. And the question kept coming back to my mind, is God calling us out to start another church? Am I about to go back into what I said I would never do again? This was about the time our little group of folks had grown to probably 30 to 40 people. And we had outgrown the houses that we were meeting in. And we had contacted John Metters at the Western store to see if we might be able to meet in the Western store. And he reluctantly let us meet in just the jeans department, which is kind of funny when you stop to think about it. He had just closed the store down. It was still full of merchandise, but we met in one little small section of the store. And more people were coming. People were feeling a connection. People in the community were coming. We were growing. We began to occupy more space in the store, and within just a very few months, we decided to officially organize as a church at that point. Even at that time, the thought of that, how can this little band of ragamuffins pull something like that off? And every time that we would come up to a challenge or a very important decision that would have to be made, there was always this question and statement, we can't do this. How in the world can we do this? And we were right. We couldn't. Every single moment, every single challenge that we came up against, there would be somebody who would stand up and remind us of how God, in one circumstance or another in our short little history, had proven himself to be faithful. And there's only a handful of people that's left that gathered around our table that Sunday morning. But I would venture to say that if you would ask any of us that are still here, if we ever would have dreamed that we would be here today, we would laugh and tell you no. We had no idea what was ahead of us. We had no idea what God had intended. What our enemy intended for evil, God intended for good.
All right, so many of you who have come, and maybe you're new here, and you see Caleb here leading music and leading the worship, and you have no idea the background, and wanted to share some of that with you because we're sitting here today in this building specifically in large part because of Kel and Connie and their willingness to move forward and the group of people that was surrounding them. And I wanted to ask just a couple of questions of follow-up as we close up today. We talked through Esther, and we saw the passage there in chapter 4 where Mordecai sent the word of what needed to be done. And there was this sense of fear and like all these excuses that started coming up, and I could be killed, and I haven't seen him in a month. I don't know if I've lost favor with him, whatever it is. And part of that, I think, comes from the unknown and the uncertainty and the fear that it might not work out the way we want it to. When you go back and you think about that time of y'all being able to take those steps of faith, how much fear did you guys have that, you know what, we take this step, this may not work?
Well, that was almost every week.
Yeah.
Because when we those early days we first started, we didn't really have any idea if the next Sunday, if there were to be anybody who would show up.
Yeah.
And so once we experienced, week after week after week of meeting together and people coming, and it was kind of funny because I think word had gotten out in the community that there was a group that was meeting together for Bible studies in homes, and they're a bunch of disenfranchised people from church. And so that's who we attracted at first, and I think still do to a certain element today. And so each week as we would grow and get bigger, it was like, this isn't because of us at all. So the fear of failure, we were just like, okay, God, this still doesn't work. It's on you.
Yeah.
If you're calling us to do something, we have to rely on you for that.
Yeah. Well, and you look back into Esther and you talk about those times, and you see so often in the story God working behind the scenes, seemingly, in the different things that he, giving the king favor to extend the scepter, from, reading through the Chronicles and coming across Mordecai and having the gallows bit, all those things that work together. And then you guys, I know there were a couple of things that you look back and you saw God working that really couldn't be explained any other way than divine intervention.
Yeah, two things, quickly. One of them was within my own life. I grew up in a pastor's home. And so I got all the inside baseball, all the behind-the-scenes info that most people never get to see, and that's a good thing because it tends to be ugly at times. It's always been kind of surprising to me how mean and vicious church people can be to each other. And so it had ruined me to the point, like I said in the video, that I didn't want my kids, they were fairly young at the time, to grow up in an environment like that. So I guess the biggest thing, number one, which was definitely a God thing, was like in some of the songs that we sang this morning, it was restoration in my life. It was a bringing back that I felt like I would never have again, and had built a wall up around that. So number one, it was God's faithfulness and his restoring me back to feeling like a son of God rather than somebody that was, rejected. And number two, one of the biggest things that was just an absolute God thing is the land that we're on right now. And we were in the Western store at the time, and there might have been 50 or 60 of us that were there when we organized as a church. And Bob Murray had driven past his property, and it's 26 acres, I believe, at the time. And there was for sale sign on it, and he said, what about that property over there? But there was already a contract on it for $300,000 and some odd, if I remember correctly. And I said, well, we can't afford that. There's no way we can do that. So he's driving back. The sign went down when the contract went on. He lived over here at the time on Arnold Lane. And he was driving back by one day, and he came to church, and he said, you know what? The for sale sign's back up there. So it must have fallen through. So we recontacted the landowners, and it was $350,000, I think is what they're asking for. We're like, we can't do that. There's no way. And so we thought, well, let's just shoot them an offer, which we did kind of jokingly at $156,000. And Bob called back and said, they took it. And that's when the panic set in. And I remember my dad standing up in front of us that Sunday afternoon when we got the offer, or the news that they accepted the offer. And he said, we better get on our knees and pray, really hard about this, because I'm looking out here. I don't think there's $156,000 sitting out here right now. And so, it was just, that was a big deal. But there were so many, Matt, little small incidences that just seemed like they were impossible to overcome. Every single time, God proved himself.
Well, in Esther, you saw where God used that Jewish girl to save an entire nation. And Mordecai said that, if you don't want to be participating in this, and you don't want to be a part of what God's going to do, and you don't want him to let him use you to accomplish his purpose, it's going to get accomplished. And it did through Esther. And I look back and I see what you guys went through, and I have a similar situation, and I'll share some of that coming up in 4 weeks, but similar situation to that, but you guys went through some hurt and some trials and some things where you thought you were done. And God used that, and he put you in this community at that time for something different. And you said that on the story in the video, that you felt like if God was calling you to start another church, it had to be for something different, because there were 300 other churches on every other corner in this town. And so it had to be for something different. And so God's purpose and God's intention was for something different to be established. And, today we're accused of being hyper grace teachers, which that's an insult. But we feel like different in a lot of ways, but not in better or worse or whatever, but just different. And when you look back and you see what God did through that time, do you consider that you guys went through what you went through and put you in that place for such a time as this, and he's used you to, in essence, release so many of us, myself included, from some of the shackles of legalism?
Absolutely, because that we came out of a very legalistic church culture, and there was kind of a saying back then, after we had kind of saw that God was using us in a way that we never imagined, and I don't even know who started it, but it was somebody said, "I ain't going back." And I think that just kind of carries through to today, to understand that because of circumstances that we couldn't explain nor understood through that hurt, that God introduced us to the unfiltered, for the first time, the unfiltered, unadulterated message of God's grace. It wasn't blended with law. It was grace, which is the age that we live in. And much like we said back then, I can say today, I ain't going back to that.
I'm with you. All right, so last thing. You see where you've been through. You see the journey that you've taken, ups and downs and speed bumps along the way. If you could go back to that moment you felt like God was calling you to do something different in Texarkana and take that step and move into it, would you do it again?
Absolutely.
Okay. You better say yes. Yeah. No, and I appreciate y'all's willingness and faithfulness in that. And I want to leave you with this, because so many things that have come up today, and Kel said it in the video, he said it just a few minutes ago. Whatever it is in your life that God's calling you into, I don't know what it is. We've talked about that. I can't individualize every single circumstance and situation. Whatever it is, it's for you. God has it for you. But here's the thing, it's not up to you. It's not up to you. God wants to fulfill his purpose in your life, and he wants to use you to do great things. And it's going to be accomplished with or without you. But he wants to use you. He wants you to participate. He wants you to share in the blessings. He wants you to share in the fruit that's produced because of your faith and the trust that you have in him. And it's not up to you. Whatever it is, I promise you, it's not up to you. Take that step of faith. Move to where God's calling you. Let me pray. God, thank you for today. The time we have, God, thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your words. Thank you for being unchanging from the beginning of time to today, to be a God of promises. Thank you for giving us the promise to be able to stand and trust you. And I pray that we grow to know you more intimately so that we can trust you on a deeper level. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.